Maybe it's time to let the other side have a go.
Because all governments run out of steam in the end, don't they? I mean, if you look at Macmillan was 13 years, Thatcher was 11, Blair was 13, and it's now 12.
14. Well, 12 going on 14, yeah.
So maybe. And you can listen to my full conversation with Jeffrey Archer by subscribing to the Iain Dale Book Club podcast on Global Player. Coming up in a moment on LBC, it's Tuesday's edition of Cross Question. I'll be joined in the studio by Dame Meg Hillier, Labour MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch and Chair of the Commons Public Accounts Committee. Dr Kieran Mullan is Conservative MP for Crewe and Nantwich. Richard Power-Sayeed is political commentator, former Labour Party official and author of the book 1997, The Future That Never Happened. And Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe is political correspondent for the Financial Times. They're here to answer your calls on 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and you can tell Alexa, send a comment to LBC and then just say your question. Don't forget to watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. Former and current politicians have been reacting to Matt Hancock losing the Tory whip after agreeing to join the lineup for the reality show I'm a Celebrity. Number 10 says the Prime Minister is unlikely to be watching the show, which allies say he will use to promote his work on dyslexia. Author Christine Hamilton and wife of former politician Neil Hamilton appeared on the very first series of the show. She's been telling Andrew Marr on LBC his reasons for going on are not justified.
He is a Member of Parliament. He's paid pretty handsomely by normal standards to be either in Westminster or his constituency, looking after his constituents' interests, or the interests of the country, who at the moment are going through the most horrendous cost of living crisis.
OK.
Rishi Sunak has told his cabinet the UK will always be a compassionate, welcoming country. The Home Secretary has been criticised for describing an influx of asylum seekers to the UK as an invasion of the South Coast. Suella Braverman has denied blocking alternative accommodation whilst facing questions about overcrowding at a processing centre in Kent. Labour's Shadow Immigration Minister Stephen Kinnock says that conflicts with claims from one Tory MP.
We need to get to the bottom of it. We need the Cabinet Secretary to do a full inquiry so that we can understand what the truth of this situation is. Because, of course, if the Home Secretary has been telling the House that she didn't block the transfers, and it turns out that, in fact, she did, then, of course, she would have been deliberately misleading the House, which would be yet another reason for why the Home Secretary would need to resign.
The Treasury's warning we should expect a rough autumn statement in a fortnight with tax rises across the board. It's understood ministers believe a huge hole in public finances can't be filled through spending cuts alone. The Resolution Foundation estimates it's around £40 billion. And Royal Mail workers are set to strike again on some of the busiest days of the year for online shopping. The two 48-hour walkouts will fall around Black Friday and Cyber Monday. The Communication Workers Union says it's part of a continuing dispute over pay and working conditions. In the markets in the city then, the FTSE 100 has closed up 91 points at 71.86. The pound buys $1.14 and €1.16. LBC weather, showers for western areas tonight, wet and windy for Northern Ireland, lows of 5. Sunny for many areas tomorrow, heavy rain moving in from the west but staying dry in the southeast, highs of 15 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. Joining me on the panel tonight are Dame Meg Hillier, Labour MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch and Chair of the Commons Public Accounts Committee, Dr Kieran Mullan, Conservative MP for Crewe and Nantwich. To my right, we have Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe, political correspondent for the Financial Times, and Richard Power-Sayeed, political commentator and former Labour Party official. They're here to take your calls. The number to call 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and you can ask Alexa to send a message, send a comment to LBC and then you just say your question. And you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, when I heard this morning that Matt Hancock was going into the jungle, I thought to myself, I think we're going to get a question from Sean in concert tonight. And hey, presto, we have. Sean, very good evening.
How are you doing? I tell you what it is, I'm absolutely spitting blood here, like.
You always are.
An MP, or isn't it? It's supposed to be an MP. Shouldn't he be kicked out of Parliament?
Well, that's a very simple question. Should he be kicked out of Parliament? Meg Hillier.
Well, look, we have rules about kicking people out of Parliament, and you have to commit a crime, though you may feel it maybe feel a bit criminal to see Matt Hancock eating goodness knows what on in the jungle. But I think frankly, Sean, I agree it's pretty shocking, and I do think that colleagues need to remember in Parliament we're there to be working politicians. We're there as a servant of the people that we represent and to be supporting the country to do the right thing, especially, well, obviously, we're not in government, so that's harder for my party at the moment. But we're not celebrities. We are working politicians, and I think that this is a trend I don't approve of. And well, Matt Hancock's obviously got other ambitions. I think perhaps he's planning to leave Parliament anyway.
Is it just this programme that you object to him doing, or would it be any form of reality TV? Because there have been there was one years and years ago where I can remember, I think Michael Portillo was one of the MPs. They all went to live in a council house.
I was offered that. And I said no, because it was quite patronising. I visit my constituents. Last few weeks I've done 3 of those doorstep surgeries, been into people's homes and seen, and talked to them in detail about their issues. And I think it's really patronising to say, I'm going to go and live and learn your lifestyle. I just think, so actually, though that's perhaps on the slightly better side than the going into the jungle. But I do think we're not celebrities. There's a whole celebrity culture that seems to be breeding through politics. We've seen a prime minister, a failed prime minister, who's more interested in Instagram than one turned out to be governing the country. And I think we've got to think a bit more about what we're there to do. Someone once called me Captain Sensible, and my husband thought it was a good description, which I was a bit disappointed about that bit of it. But actually,
I'm sure you have your daring side.
Well, there you go. Now you're tempting me there, Ian. Maybe after the show. But seriously, I think that while that may but actually I've got a job to do. I've got quite a serious job chairing the Public Accounts Committee. But equally, Kieran, I think, is a serious politician, and I think that's really what I'd like to see, a bit more of serious politics, not this sort of frippery.
Well, Kieran, Nadine Dorries went into the jungle quite a few years ago now. She got re-elected after that, I think with an increased majority. So Matt Hancock could have looked at that experience and think, well, what have I got to lose?
We're getting back to the question. Ultimately, if his constituents, if he puts himself forward and he's allowed to run, then his constituents choose to re-elect him. That's their choice as constituents. But I've got a lot of sympathy with what Meg said, really. We're not celebrities, we're there to do a job. I think you've hinted at the fact that there might be other formats of reality TV that perhaps don't draw on your time in the same way, because Matt's argument, I understand, is about engaging the public and going to where the public want to see people. But this is just such an extreme version of it that makes it so difficult for you to do your own day job that I really struggle, and I understand why they've taken the whip away from him.
It makes you wonder whether he's ever watched the programme, because of course he says, well, he think he can promote his dyslexia campaign, which is a laudable campaign, but does he really think that ITV are going to show him sort of lecturing all of the other contestants about his dyslexia campaign?
I can see the memes now with a surname like Hancock on certain bush trucker trials. I can see the memes coming now. They're going to get me all sorts of different things, and so I don't think it's actually going to get the serious interest in the policy issue that he wants, which is unfortunate, because we do know he does care a lot about that issue. He's passionate about it in Parliament, but I'm just not quite sure this is the right way.
Shall I reveal what his nickname was when he was at the Culture, Media and Sport Secretary? Does anyone know this?
Can you say it on air at this time?
I think I can. Hat Mancock. Jasmine. Would you like to answer the question after that bombshell?
I mean, obviously, Matt and his team, they've put forward a lot of caveats to this. So, as you were saying, they've said that it provides a platform for Matt to talk about his dyslexia campaign. They've argued that constituents will be able to contact him on urgent matters. But I think overall, the optics of this don't look good. Ultimately, MPs, it's a full-time job. It's not a part-time hobby. And their priorities should be to the constituents who they are accountable to. And I think it just, as Meg was saying, it speaks to this wider trend of MPs dipping in and dipping out of politics. Not all, the majority of whom are there to do their job and serve their constituents. But if you think to, for example, Boris Johnson, who's been on several holidays since he stepped down from being PM, who is giving lots of talks and on the speaking gig, it's this wider feeling of actually people want to feel as though their MPs are representing them and they're the priority, not trying to get some sort of lucrative media career or be a celebrity in their own right.
And of course, it's entirely coincidental, but his pandemic diaries are coming out, I think, the day that I'm a Celebrity finishes, or that week anyway, because I hopefully booked him to come here to do a phone-in that Thursday, and I'm thinking, well, is that going to happen now if he's going to do that? I don't know.
Yes, it will, because there's no chance of him staying in the jungle that long. This guy's going to get voted out the moment he goes in. He's going to be shredded by the celebrities.
He's got to stay in for at least 5 days so he can do 5 bush tucker trials.
I have no idea how it works, but I'll trust you on that one.
I'm a man of the people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm North London and Lee. Look, they're East London, whatever. Look, he's going to go in. I worked very closely with people who were bereaved by the pandemic, during the pandemic. And the anger that there is towards people like him is so intense, and it is so legitimate. And he's going to go in and he's going to be shredded by celebrities who had negative experiences during the pandemic and are really angry at him, and I think it's going to be very unpleasant for him. And this guy ultimately is doing something extremely pragmatic, copying Nadine Dorries, copying Penny Mordaunt, of course, who did the
Splash.
There you go. This is somebody who, I mean, if he was a bit more evil, then he would. Yeah,
she actually did that for a reason, because she had a campaign in her constituency to rebuild the local, is it Lido or Lido?
Yeah.
Lido, isn't it? And all the money that she got for that went to do it, and it's now reopened. I think it's quite unclear at the moment what's going to happen to the money, because he said he'd be making a donation to a dyslexia charity, but he doesn't say I'm going to be paying the whole fee to the dyslexia charity.
It's about increasing his visibility. Some Tory politicians who are a bit talentless but sufficiently evil to say far-right things that they may or may not believe in, that's how they put themselves forward within the party and within the public sphere. Some, like Gavin Williamson and Grant Shapps, they're very good at some kind of backroom dealings. That's how they get themselves into the cabinet. It would seem that Hancock doesn't have either of those abilities, and this is his pragmatic way of achieving it. The problem is that he's incredibly unlikable, and he he kind of makes people cringe as soon as they see him. He'll be voted out. He'll be very sad.
I mean, can I just say, I think first of all, to categorise certain Tory politicians as evil on a day where I'm sure we're going to get onto use of language is not particularly helpful. And I know a lot, at the time there was a lot of criticism about the handling of the pandemic, but as time's gone on and we've seen a better evidence look at things like death rates and outbreaks, the UK's record on that, and therefore Matt's record on that, it compares favourably well actually to most of Western Europe, better than many Western European countries actually. So I don't think it's fair to kind of characterise him entirely as not someone who's had something to contribute to public life just because he's made a decision.
Well, do you not think though that his entire reputation finished with that picture of him?
Yeah, indeed. And so I understand. I understand
up
the
until that
feeling.
point, I think most of the general public actually had sympathy for politicians, whether it was him or anybody in government in this country, around the world, having to grapple with something that nobody's ever had to grapple with before. But that moment just blew it.
Yeah,
and,
indeed.
And there's no way back from that, is there?
Yeah, and I think I'm sure he's come to understand people's feelings on that quite strong. And I think, as you've said, probably going into the mainstream media in this way is going to bring all that back to the fore, which is unfortunate. But I just think it's important to put on the record that he, in terms of actions he took during the pandemic, the record of, at the time, we said repeatedly attempts to compare the UK's death rate in the way that was being done at the time were not accurate, and that's proven to be correct when they've gone back and looked at it properly, comparing death rates properly.
Or should we wait for the inquiry?
Well,
indeed,
you can look at some of the Public Accounts Committee's reports and National Audit Office reports, and they also point out some of the flaws in the early stages, and we even get a bit of leeway recognising that in the early days it was very hasty decisions made, but the same mistakes were repeatedly, and we've done a lot of work on this from June 20 onwards, and so and Matt Hancock completely endlessly defends everything he did, rather than sometimes saying, well, actually there were lessons that we could learn from that.
I have heard him say that there were lessons to be learned and that they did change their views on some things over time.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, if you are a Secretary of State in a situation like that, you're inevitably going to want to defend your record. But
the PPE contracts, the VIP lists, these are things that
but as much as some of the criticism has proven to be valid, and I think in a situation like that, the government's not going to get everything right. Some of the fundamental accusations that were made have not stood up to the evidence. And my understanding is all the legal cases have actually confirmed that no contracts have been awarded inappropriately or otherwise have been awarded.
There's a lot still in dispute. They haven't done
something that he did, of course, apologise for was breaking the rules that he had contributed to making. And we, of course, can think of some other Conservative politicians who have not yet apologised for breaking those rules.
Jasmine, how do you think this is going to play more generally politically? Because it feeds into this narrative that I think there was prevalent in the 1990s when there were lots of sort of I'm not saying this is a sleazy thing particularly, but it just plays into the narrative that some MPs are not really in it for doing their jobs properly. I mean, you kind of hinted at that earlier. Is this going to affect the Conservative Party more widely, or do you think it's just going to be his reputation that is affected here?
I mean, Downing Street have been very clear to distance themselves from Matt Hancock. I think there was a statement from the PM spokesperson saying Rishi Sunak isn't going to be tuning in anytime soon. And obviously we saw... I bet. We heard from the Chief Whip, Simon Hart, who, was pretty quick to, suspend him from the party. So the party is acting quite quickly on this. And we've heard from other Tory MPs.
And his own Conservative Association tonight have released a statement, which if I was him, I might be thinking deselection is on the cards.
Yes. I mean, it's questionable as to whether Hancock actually wants to continue a career in politics. It might be a case that this is actually a platform that enables him to enter into a lucrative media career. We see people like Ed Balls, who did lots of reality TV shows, and their sort of post-parliamentary career worked out quite well. I mean, I don't think this individual issue sort of reflects on the Conservative Party as a whole. I think there are so many other bigger concerns like cost of living, rising energy bills, the government's handling of the economy that are more crucial. I think people see this as a very individual issue to do with Matt Hancock. And as you were saying, some people find him quite cringeworthy. Some people are angry about how he conducts himself during the pandemic. I think the party will separate itself from him.
He's one of these politicians, I think, that doesn't necessarily come over as his real self on camera. I don't know how well you know him, Kieran, but my experience of him over the past, in fact, I've known him probably for about 12 years. One-to-one, off camera, off mic, he's actually very entertaining, very funny guy, but that doesn't translate to the image that he has with the general public.
I mean, I think it's always difficult. Most politicians are not particularly well known. He became relatively well known.
Well, that's enough about you.
Well, maybe one day. Ian.
One day.
Most aren't particularly well known, and so I think when you become very well known for a particular thing that isn't positive, that's really difficult to overcome for anybody.
Sean, I'm not going to come back to you because I think we got a hint of your views there. Thank you very much indeed for the question. We'll move on in a moment. You're listening to or watching LBC's Cross Question. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Variable. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Welcome back to Cross Question. It's 8:20 on LBC. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel is 0345 6060 973. If you can't call, you can text 84850 or ask Alexa, send a comment to LBC and then just say your question. We have with us today Meg Hillier, Labour MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch and Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, Conservative MP for Crewe and Nantwich, Dr Kieran Mullan, Richard Power-Sayeed, political commentator, former Labour Party official and author of the book 1997, The Future That Never Happened, and Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe, political correspondent for the Financial Times. Let's go to our next question. It's a text question from Paul in Paisley. How would you define a terrorist attack? The short questions are often the most difficult, aren't they, Richard?
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think somebody who has been radicalised by a government that's deliberately dividing our communities and who then goes and bombs incredibly vulnerable people, that sounds like a terrorist attack to me.
You're referring to the Dover attack 2 days ago.
So you're blaming the government for someone attacking a camp?
I think that there's a significant moral responsibility for a government that uses incredibly divisive language to describe incredibly vulnerable people, puts out claims about what the ethnicity or the nationality of those people are without, as I understand it, significant degree of evidence around that. And yes, I mean, that's definitely going to encourage extreme, illegitimate anger, and there is probably going to be a very significant connection between that and the expression of that
I just find it interesting, whilst I think language and discourse in society is something that we need to be mindful of. For your first port of call when it comes to a potential terrorist attack to be to blame the government and language, I think it's just, you've got it completely the wrong way around. Ultimately, people are responsible for their own actions. And if someone wants to adopt an ideology, and at this stage we don't know for definite what that surrounds this event, that's their responsibility. And just the priorities you've done in answering that, emphasising answering that question, I just think are completely the wrong way around.
Richard, the police have so far said it isn't a terrorist attack.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is?
I would trust the police to know what they're doing, but
you clearly don't, because you've described this as a terrorist attack in your first answer.
It seems to me that if somebody is deliberately targeting incredibly vulnerable people within the context of politicians deliberately whipping up hatred and division against those very vulnerable people, then that sounds like a terrorist attack to me. I mean, I don't know what the police's motivation is, though.
Kieran, it is interesting, isn't it, that we automatically assume that if there is a brown-skinned person involved in some sort of violent act like this, then it is automatically described as a terrorist attack. And yet when a white person is involved, there seems to be a bit of a reluctance to do that. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think we probably have to separate out what the commentariat and politicians and the public do versus the authorities. I think they tend to be much more considered regardless of who's involved. I think it's... For me, a terrorist attack, that you have to kind of separate out people who are perhaps have mental health issues and might ascribe to some motivation that's linked to an ideology, but actually that they were probably in because of their personal circumstances and what was going on with them, conducted a violent act that otherwise would have happened, versus a deliberate, organised, politically driven activity that's got a clear political objective, and that for me is probably a closer description of a terrorist attack. There are sometimes, it's not unusual for people who've been committed of violent acts to claim some ideology towards it, but it's not really credible evidence that really was a motivating factor for them. So I think it's very difficult to be black and white about it. And I think it's not unexpected that for the general population, if most of the media attention over many, many, many years now has been linked to Islamist terror, that's in their minds and provokes that kind of reaction. That's not to say that the authorities don't take action across the spectrum of possible terrorist activities. And
because if you look at the Prevent programme now, they're dealing with far more so-called far-right extremists than they are
That's what I'm thinking
Islamists.
About. Yes, exactly. So as long as the authorities are doing the right thing, I think that's what's most important. And I think it is difficult. I think if we were to get a gap in time where there weren't particularly high-profile Islamist attacks, then you might see the public perception about this stuff change over time. But to change it in the short term is quite difficult, I think.
Jasmine.
I mean, seems like a simple question, but it doesn't necessarily have a straightforward answer. I mean, I would argue that it's an individual who carries out a violent attack and the motivation is hate-filled. And as Kieran was saying, there is a, political link to that as well. Perhaps they're connected to a wider organisation or ideology. I think it is important to note that obviously authorities are still investigating what happened at the immigration centre, and the police will have their reasons for why they haven't determined it to be a terrorist attack just yet. We don't know if they will in the coming days. But I do think it's important that they're given the space to draw their own conclusions, and that the attack is condemned in the strongest terms, but we just sort of let the investigation play out.
Somebody said to me yesterday, well, it's clear that the attacker had mental health problems, or it was rumoured that he had. And I was thinking, yeah, but surely to even conduct an attack like that, you would have to have some form of mental health problem. But sometimes that is used as an excuse rather than an explanation, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that this was an attack on an incredibly vulnerable group of people who are just there because they were hoping to, build a life for themselves in a safer country. And I think overall, it is important to note in our discussions about migration that actually for someone to, put themselves in a position where they're on a small, unstable boat trying to get across the channel, ultimately that's a desperate situation, and, individuals need to be treated with compassion in wider conversations when we're talking about immigration policy.
We should make clear that the counter-terrorism police have now taken on this investigation, and the man has been identified as a 66-year-old man from High Wycombe, Andrew Leake, and the police said it was likely the attack was sparked by this is their quote, not mine, some form of hate-filled grievance, though this may not necessarily meet the threshold of terrorism. I mean, that phrase in itself, Meg, is interesting, the threshold of terrorism. I mean, I would have thought it was quite clear that if someone launches an attack like this and it is hate-filled through some sort of grievance and it is a violent attack and petrol bombs were used here, that surely has to qualify as terrorism.
Well, no, I mean, if you're being really pedantic about this, I think it's actually about being part of or believing in a wider ideology. So one angry person doesn't make a terrorist attack, but if they ascribe to or are part of a wider organisation, then they're a terrorist. But I think it is, one of the others said something about, often people are thought to have mental health problems and it's easily seen as an excuse. And actually, often it's not the case. So when Joe Cox was murdered, that came out first of all. And I think when these situations happen, my instinctive reaction, and I was a Home Office Minister, of course, a long time ago, is not to rush to judgment, to let the authorities do their job, and then there may be decisions for politicians to make down the line. But actually, another sign of politics today that people immediately come out with a position on something, and I think it's wise to wait and see.
Let's just go back to what Richard said originally, because I was quite interested in your immediate reaction to that, Kieran, because, I mean, he's right that the Home Secretary has made some incendiary comments over the past 48 hours, using words like, phrases like invasion of the South Coast, scourge. And when one of your colleagues, Lee Anderson, said, well, if they don't like the conditions at Manston, they can go back to France in rubber dinghies. And she said, yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I don't imagine that you can defend that.
Well, no, I think, and it picks up on the comments that have been said about, I think some of the points that Suella made yesterday were very important, actually, and do actually cut to the heart of this debate, and that is the public are not fools, and they know that not every single person who's crossing that channel is doing so out of sheer desperation for fear of their life. The public know that. We've had the testimony for select committees recently about the figures around the number of these people being young Albanian men. I don't think anyone here thinks that Albania is a country through which people at that sort of scale should be seeking asylum, if at all.
Well, then she should do something about it.
Well, process them quicker would be a good
we've been
start.
trying. First of all, the scale of the problem has increased significantly over the last couple of years. At the same time as having to deal with that, we don't control who makes asylum claims. So in terms of the number of people
you do
making,
control the conditions under which they do.
Indeed.
Why not do what the German government have done and said we're not going to have any asylum claims from Albania in the future?
Well, I would personally be supportive of stronger measures like that. And actually, it was briefed out that the government were going to seek to go down that route, but then internal legal advice suggested that they wouldn't be able to do that without further legal reform. So we're going through the process of legal reform to allow us to be tougher on illegitimate claims, changes that the Labour Party have opposed all the way through, and whatever system we have in place whatever we deem as legitimate or illegitimate, there will always be people who want to go around that system, and we have to be honest with people and say that's just not acceptable.
But do you think her language
yesterday
yesterday was acceptable? Because Robert Jenrick, the immigration minister, clearly does not.
It's not. I wouldn't have used those exact words, but I think you do get sometimes a gap in politics where, on the one hand, you have a reluctance amongst particularly Labour politicians to even describe some of these people as illegal immigrants, which to my mind, they're certainly not here legally. If there's a huge gap between the rhetoric that politicians talk about and what the public can see for themselves, that generates problems too. And so I think Suella is attempting there. If you live on the south coast and you're seeing the scale of the issue in terms of regularly seeing boats of people coming onto the coast, you're going to feel very strongly about it, and you're going to use blunt language.
Though, is it?
It's not a word I would have used, but I don't think we can. We have to get better at describing this in terms that the public can identify with, and not hiding away from the harsh reality that I'm afraid not every single one of these people is a desperate migrant. I mean, they're all coming from France for a start. That's what my constituents say to me all the time. Caring, considered constituents of mine who are charitable people say to me they're coming from France. So the idea that they're fleeing a war-torn country, I'm afraid, is just not true.
Okay, and this is the government that we can't put people back under the Dublin II arrangements, which was the European system of exchange. But look, this is 12 years of a Conservative government. 38,000 people so far come over this year. 96% have not even been processed. It's taking over a year. And when I was the minister, I was looking at trying to get better legal advice right at that first stage so that we could determine very quickly whether someone had a right to asylum or not. And if not, then the rules say you have to go. And if you do have a right to asylum, then we should have a much better system of welcoming. And frankly, this is also gumming up the system for people. I had someone the other day, a very senior doctor, trying to get a new visa just to move to a different hospital. And it's gummed up in the system. And I've got many cases like that, people who are here legitimately working, and because of the chaos in the Home Office immigration system, they can't stay and do their job. Or in fact, they're really struggling. So it's having a major impact, and it's all on the 12 years of under a Conservative government.
And I would be the first to say that the Home Office has issues, but you have also got to put into the context, in this same time period, they'd have to deal with tens of thousands of applicants for the Ukrainian scheme, thousands of applicants for the Afghan scheme, hundreds of thousands of people from the Hong Kong scheme. So in addition, the huge surge there was in passport applications. So the sheer workload is a big workload. And can I just finish? The other point I'd like to make is what you also didn't have to deal with in government was the Modern Slavery Act. So that's something we brought in with good intentions to stop people being trafficked, very, very vulnerable people. Again, the evidence is quite clear now. That is being exploited. And again, when we brought this up in the House, when we've talked about the need to reform it, we get accused of not caring about modern slavery, when we know an awful lot, again, of these Albanian people.
Very brief response.
Well, look, I mean, I was a minister dealing with both immigration and passports, and if you have the right capacity, you can deliver these things. And it should not be that when we welcome people from Ukraine fleeing war, that the rest of the system goes into chaos. But this is what it's a bit, it's either in the Home Office. One problem arises and everything else goes to pot, and that's because of the austerity and the cuts that we've seen over
I remember the passport problem under Labour. So.
Well, not under my watch. I can tell you the passports were always on time.
In a moment, they can continue this in the break. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's 8:33 news headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
Allies of Matt Hancock claim viewers of I'm a Celebrity will get to see more of his human side after it was confirmed he'll be joining the show. The former Health Secretary has had the Tory whip removed and will now sit in the Commons as an independent MP. The Treasury's warning we should expect a rough autumn statement in a fortnight with tax rises across the board. It's understood ministers believe a huge hole in public finances can't be filled through spending cuts alone. Royal Mail workers will stage 2 48-hour strikes around two of the biggest online shopping days of the year. They're set to walk out on Black Friday and Cyber Monday later this month in a dispute over pay, jobs and conditions. LBC weather: showers for western areas tonight, wet and windy for Northern Ireland, a low of 5 degrees.
This is LBC. leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:37. Meg Hillier, Kieran Mullan, Richard Power-Sayeed and Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe are with us, answering your calls. Here's one from Tom in Worcester. Hello, Tom.
Oh, hi, Ian. Good evening, everybody. With the exception of Sir Peter Bottomley, why is it that all the Tories always vote against more human rights and equality?
I think that's being a bit unfair on people who are not called Peter Bottomley, but Kieran, do you want to take that one head on?
I say, as a gay man, delighted that we brought in gay marriage for gay people in this country is just one example. In terms of equality and championing equality as a party, we've got our just had our third female prime minister, no matter how short-lived it was. I think we do a lot for equality. I don't quite know where he's got that assumption as a particular.
Tom, are you thinking of any particular laws here?
Well, I'm always on the internet looking up on how members of Parliament vote, and when it comes to equality and human rights, there's no details. It just says votes for, votes against.
That'll be they work for you, I'm afraid. And as much as I encourage public engagement in politics, I'm not sure that there's summaries.
I mean, he has got a point. I mean, on equal marriage, for example, the majority of Tory MPs voted against that at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think Conservative parties, by nature, whatever country they're in, don't necessarily tend to be on the forefront of social change, and that means historically, they sometimes get caught behind society in some respects. But that's the downside to being a conservative movement, is that you're not always going to be on the ball when it comes to progressive change, and that's something that again I've come to terms with my own party and our history. But that they tend to reflect the nation at the same time. The nation tends to be more conservative as well. There's room for both dynamics in politics, progression and conservatism. Overall, I think conservatism and slow change are a good thing for society, though I accept on occasions it does mean that you end up on the wrong side of certain arguments from a historical perspective. There are very, very high-profile left-wing politicians. You could say the same thing about Hillary Clinton. I don't think anyone would describe Hillary Clinton as anything but progressive. She was opposed to gay marriage, at various points in her career. So it's just something that, I think we accept.
Jasmine, do you think, following on from that question, do you think the Conservative Party has always reverted to what it used to be, a sort of small c Conservative Party, whereas under David Cameron, possibly to a lesser extent Theresa May, it was seen as a much more liberal Conservative Party?
I mean, I do think the party is still really figuring out its identity at the moment, and the Tories have been in power for several years, and if you look at voting records with various MPs, there is actually a bit of a mix, and there is a generational divide, I'd say, between some of the younger Tories, maybe those who have been recently elected on issues, for example, LGBTQ plus equality. So I don't think it's possible to sort of, give a broad brush approach. I do think,
and then you get exceptions like David Davis, who was seen to be on the right, but on civil liberties issues, would ally himself with a lot of Labour MPs.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, this is politics, so you'll hear MPs taking a particular stance because it appeals to Tory members, and they might take a very different stance if there was a general election. So I do think there is an element of taking what's being said at a particular time with a pinch of salt. And I do think when it comes to votes are highly politicised, and there may be a reason why a certain MP is, shepherded towards to voting in one area that doesn't necessarily align with their beliefs, which shouldn't necessarily be the case, but it's what happens.
When you say shepherded, of course, in the case of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Therese Coffey, pushed and pulled.
Well, did I?
I think it's. Every MP will make their own judgment up to a point, and parties have positions. But I think that we have heard some very unfortunate and very actually downright unacceptable rhetoric, and just in the last couple of days alone, that create this sense of other. And I think that one of the problems of the Conservative Party at the moment is that the right of the Conservative Party there seems to be a need for Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister feels he needs to pander to that. And actually, I think that there is a sort of tension going on in the party, and I hope that for all our sakes, the sort of Liberal group of the party win out in the end, because it doesn't help anybody when you have these sort of not I was going to say manufactured, but these very over the top statements like the current Home Secretary's made, which really don't help at all.
Richard.
Well, I think Jasmine put it very well in terms of the tension between what some politicians will do for the kind of stakeholder management, trying to make themselves more popular within the Conservative Parliamentary Party. What they'll do then, they'll speak to perhaps the most vicious factions of the party if it's what they need to do. And then we have to think about what they'll do for electoral purposes, which will often be very different. I think the Conservative Party is facing a really difficult couple of years, obviously, in terms of mortgages are going to become unaffordable for something like, maybe 3 million people over the next couple of years. Enormous numbers of people are going to see their rents soaring. They're going to be evicted from their homes.
What's to do with human rights laws?
It makes all of that. It makes all of that so politically marginal that you can imagine an election in a different kind of era when when social issues and cultural issues might be politically valent. I just don't see it happening at the next election. I think that's a big problem for the Conservative Party.
The thing I find is there is definitely a double standard in terms of the attention that's paid to Conservative politicians, Conservative election campaigns on these issues and the left. I will never forget during the Batley and Spen by-election, the Labour Party putting out a leaflet showing a Conservative Prime Minister with an Indian Prime Minister targeted at the Muslim community in that seat, really seeking quite blatantly to play up ethnic tensions that are both in India that lead to violence and in this country that have recently led to violence. You don't get anything like the same level of scrutiny or media attention when the Labour Party does something like that compared to an individual word of a Conservative politician. I'm sure Meg was as uncomfortable as many members of her party with all the stuff that went on under Jeremy Corbyn and the human rights claims around anti-Semitism. So I wish across all the politics we didn't see any of this stuff, but it's very fairly spread, and the attention that gets given to the right, I think, is not proportionate.
OK, we'll come to more of your questions in a moment. It's coming up to 8:45.
LBC. world. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:48, Meg Hillier, Kieran Mullan, Richard Power-Sayeed and Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe are with us. What is this thing about double-barreled names now for young people? I don't know. Right, let's go to...
Two parents? They both get names.
Yeah, I suppose so. Everyone has two parents, don't they? Right, text question from Juliet in Bristol. Now, you have to give me an answer to this one. You can't sort of welch out of it.
No promises.
Which government department should be cut in the next budget, and should the NHS be untouchable? So you've all got to give me one department that you think possibly could take cuts more than another, and should the NHS be untouchable? Jasmine?
Ooh. I mean, that's a question that Rishi and Jeremy will be asking themselves over the next couple of days. I mean, I genuinely don't think there is any obvious candidate. And I think part of the problem is that, this is a party that was elected in 2019 on promises for increased spending on healthcare, increased investment in northern towns. And actually, if it turns out that the government is going to be making cuts and increasing taxes, and there is a perception that we're entering into, austerity 2.0, I think that's going to be very difficult for Rishi politically. And I think specifically on the NHS, there is a general feeling that actually there isn't much more you can cut, that the service isn't running as it should be, and that more investment is needed. So, I mean, I don't have a firm answer to that. I just think it's one which, whatever they cut, is going to be politically toxic.
Richard?
Well, I'm going to try not to answer your question, if that's all right.
Can I give you a tip?
Yeah.
Never warn that you're not going to answer a question.
I'm just trying to be polite, I want to get invited back. Look,
well, if you answer the question, you will be.
Okay, I'll try to remember that one. The supposed need for these cuts comes down to the combination of a highly politicised fiscal target, which has changed over the years, and the OBR's best guesses, but those change pretty rapidly as well, as we saw last week. That's where you get this kind of magical number of 35 billion, was 70 billion cooked up, and that suddenly becomes a requirement for ruining people's lives through cuts to public services. And you know what? I'm sure there are some people who genuinely think that that's necessary, but a large number of the people who are making this political demand are people who've been demanding cuts to public services, even when they've been
So no cuts to any government department, that's what you're saying?
Maybe we can get rid of the House of Lords?
I'm not sure that counts as a government department.
It definitely doesn't.
I'll let you get away with that. Meg?
Oh, you kind of asked the wrong woman there. I look at numbers all the time in all the departments. Look, the NHS is in a catastrophic state. Waiting lists are going through the roof, and there needs to, and that's a challenge. It's being funded at 2%. Inflation, and inflation's at over 9%, 10%, and every department's effectively had a cut because of inflation already. To be honest, it is hard to know where fat is going to be cut, and so actually it's about hard political choices, not doing certain things. And
but in your job, you must have an inkling as to which government departments are, shall we say, a little bit fleshier than the others.
Well, there's not much. I mean, they certainly waste money, but that's usually because they plan a project badly and deliver a contract badly, and often, and those are the things that go wrong. But even things that have gone badly wrong, like Ajax, the new armoured vehicles, which has had 5.5 billion plus spent on it, that's 5.5 billion that's already been spent. So even if you pull that now, you don't get that money back, and you've still got to deal with a capability issue in defence. That's just one example. There are many, many, many others. But the things like schools, they're having to pay heating bills, inflation, new pension costs. So that's a choice between that and teachers.
We can't go through every government department.
But no, it's because I don't think it's. I think it's actually about a tough political choice about not doing certain things, and that's what there would be differences between the parties on what those choices would be.
I think what's been talked about is increasing spending to a lesser extent than was originally provisioned. I think that's probably more likely to be the direction of travel. I mean, I think we have a great cultural...
It's already less because of inflation, for a start.
But in terms of the absolute money, that we don't generate more money because of inflation. In terms of what the government's going to take off people to put back into the, through taxes into spending, we can't magic that a higher number because of inflation. So in terms of the money we were going to take from off people...
Well, my point is there'll be cuts to services because of inflation, regardless of the 40 billion hole in the budget.
I understand, and I was going to go on, and I recognise the challenge around the NHS. I think it's always important to point out, I worked in the NHS, it's more doctors than ever before, more nurses than ever before, more money than ever before. The challenges that the ageing population and the backlog with COVID is driving demand through the roof, and it's how we manage that. And it's a challenge facing most developed countries in the world. We're at the point now where I think something like 40% of all government spending is on the NHS, and there comes a political limit to what people accept being spent on one particular element.
So no cuts to the NHS, but any departments. If you were Chancellor now, Who would you have your eye on?
Well, I think when we go back to this point about major infrastructure projects, and we're still not very good at that in this country, and I don't think we have been for a very long time. Meg's fairly pointed out things we could have done better in this period of government, but, NAO reports go back decades in terms of highlighting that we don't do those things very well, and I always find that frustrating. I've never been a minister. I don't know how they end up going awry in the way that they do, but I think we have to get better at those, and you save huge amounts of money when you do that. And also, let's not underestimate the government's accepted we made some mistakes, or the previous administration did. If the markets continue moving in the right direction, actually the volume of money we might need to cut back is going to shrink.
Basically we haven't had a single answer from any of you, which illustrates the problem that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have got to make over the next 2 weeks, doesn't it? So
just tax the rich, of course.
And you think that's going to fill the 40 billion hole in public expenditure?
Well, there's a very interesting report out by the IPPR this morning, which showed that, if you were to, they say reverse the NIC's cut, they also show how you can start taxing financial investments in the same way that we tax other income. Of course, a windfall tax on energy profits. Those things would, of course, have the deflationary pressure that we want to have, as well as helping us to deal with.
Who was it who said you don't make the poor rich by making the rich poor?
You do if you use it for capital investment and you improve
energy profits are fair game.
I want to fit in one more question. It's from Shuvik in Eltham. Shuvik, hi. What would you like to say? Oh, he's dropped. I've got the question here anyway, so I'll read it out. Does the panel agree that we should teach less British history in schools and focus more on Asian and African history in particular? This comes after the historian Simon Seagrave Montefiore says doing this would give Britain perspective and understanding when it comes to the British Empire, especially. Meg?
Look, I don't think we do less British history necessarily, but I think it is absolutely important. I look back, I was at my mother's recently, and I found some of my old textbooks embarrassing the way they wrote. And I'm not that old, but I am over 50, and it is embarrassing the way they wrote about, possibly for your listenership, but maybe not compared with you, but anyway.
Fighting talk.
But the point is, they were written in an embarrassingly empire-centric way, almost. Absolutely extraordinary that's what I was taught when in the 80s in school. And so we definitely need, and things have changed since then, I have to say, when you think about it, I know what happens in schools in Hackney, much wider, but I definitely think we need to have that wider perspective. And I'm very fortunate that my school children in my area go to schools that are international, effectively, because their families, if not them, have come from all over the world. We're like the Ellis Island of the country, so we get that perspective in every assembly, in every classroom anyway.
Jasmine?
I don't think it's as binary as less of one and more of another. I think British history is so intertwined with the history of Africa, with countries in Asia, that actually you can't teach one without teaching the other. And so I think it would be about expanding the curriculum to take into account lots of different perspectives and perhaps filling in the gaps of history that we weren't taught about in the past. It was only when I got to university that I had the space to research things like the British Empire and join the dots myself. That wasn't something that came from school. And so I do think there is a space to broaden the curriculum in a way that doesn't, detract from some bits that we're already teaching, but actually just fills it out a bit more.
Because the trouble is, Kieran, if we don't know our own history, how can we understand the country that we live in? So you can't just sort of say, well, we should do much less British history and more world history. I would argue that there are probably subjects in the curriculum that you could drop maybe altogether and add a bit more history in.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you that you can do both at the same time, giving that wider perspective for people.
It's not physics, chemistry and biology.
Well, the thing that I think more about is languages, actually. I think in terms of equipping young people for the future, should we be teaching, when it comes to foreign languages, should it be Mandarin that we're teaching in schools as opposed to French or German? That's what I think about more. I think language and being on top of the languages of the future is going to help young people perhaps more than the individual histories that we might teach them.
Richard?
I loved learning British history and got an enormous amount out of it, but I wish it had been more global in exactly the way you're describing. The 19th century British political history was fascinating. Palmerston was such an important moment of it, but when you understand how he used foreign policy and the exploitation of that in order to manage domestic affairs, that was exciting.
Was Palmerston gunboat diplomacy? I think he was, wasn't he? Those were the days, weren't they, frankly? Let's get back to those days.
I think we're probably still there, sadly.
I remember learning about
encourage the Home
Gladstone and
Secretary.
Disraeli, but I don't remember learning anything about the British Empire, which is bizarre when you think about it.
There you go.
Right, our final fun text question, which everybody loves. Jonas asks, if you could pick 2 people, dead or alive, to send into the jungle with Matt Hancock, who would they be? That replaces the text question that I saw a few minutes ago. I think that's a really good one. Richard?
Nadine Dorris to teach him how to exploit it politically. Who's the other one going to be? I don't know, someone like Gandhi, in order to teach him how to be slightly more at peace with himself. I think he needs it.
Meg?
A nurse and a doctor from my local hospital, the Homerton.
Why?
Because I think he needs to hear from them what they think about the NHS and his tenure as head of it.
OK, Kieran?
I'll go with Nadine and Boris. I feel like Boris is, he'd enjoy that.
Nadine and Boris in a hammock in the jungle. Yeah. The mind boggles. Jasmine?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe it might be worth sending a couple of journalists and hacks down there to see,
You volunteering?
Not volunteering, but he might, open up, have some deep personal chats around the fireplace, get some good stories.
Well, let's hope so.
Deep personal chats around the fireplace, Jasmine. Be careful what you say there.
Right, thank you very much to you all, to Meg Hillier, Kieran Mullan, Richard Power-Sayeed and Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe. We'll have another episode of Cross Question tomorrow at 8. And don't forget, if you miss any episodes, you can download the podcast on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts from. And also it's on the LBC YouTube channel immediately after the programme has finished. In a moment, we are going to return to the subject of Mr. Matthew Hancock and whether he should be going to the jungle in Australia while he's still a serving MP. I'm sure you'll all have your views on that. I think the challenge in this hour is to find one of our listeners to say that, oh, yes, he should. I have no problem with that. Maybe you're a constituent of Matt Hancock in West Suffolk and you might have a view on this. The number to call 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. Migrants at an overcrowded processing centre in Kent are being moved out. The union representing Borders Force staff working at the Manston site said the Home Office were aiming to take 400 people from the site today. 2 coaches have been seen leaving the centre. A Home Office spokesperson said the department would not provide a running commentary, though, on the number of people currently there. Rishi Sunak has told his cabinet the UK will always be a compassionate, welcoming country to migrants. Number 10 says the Prime Minister is unlikely to be following former Health Secretary Matt Hancock on I'm a Celebrity. He says MPs should be working hard for their constituents after it emerged the member for West Suffolk had joined the lineup. These people in the local town of Brandon has mixed views on his TV appearance.
I think that's really good for the region. It is really good for the region. It's a good advertisement for East Anglia.
I think he's only a celebrity because of the affair. Can I say that?
I just think they should stick to what they're best at. And I think they should be getting a job done instead of doing a TV show.
His allies say he'll be promoting his work on dyslexia. Climate protesters who've spent the last month demonstrating over fossil fuels say they're suspending their action, but not before Just Stop Oil activists attempted to climb the gates of Downing Street earlier, while others glued themselves to the road. The group's also threatening to continue its disruption if the government doesn't